All right, now this is tape 2 of Stuart Little. We've already recorded one tape, both sides, haven't we?
Yep.
Okay.
I brushed my teeth.
Okay, honey. I don't know that you did that, but we'll see. Okay, now remember he had a little car?
Yeah.
And it all crashed. Remember that, how it drove around the room because the doctor made it invisible?
Yeah.
In the button, and they couldn't find it, and it crashed and broke? Okay, well, now this is chapter 12, and it's called The Schoolroom. So we're reading Stuart Little by E.B. White. And now it's already 1993, isn't it? January 4th, 1993. Okay, here we go. It says that while Dr. Carey was making repairs on the car, Stuart went shopping. He decided that since he was about to take a long motor trip, he should have the proper clothes. And so he went to a doll shop where they had things which were the right size for him because he's so little, remember. And they outfitted himself completely with new luggage and shirts and suits and accessories. And he charged everything and was well pleased with his purchases. And that night he slept at the doctor's apartment. Shy, are we going to lay down here and just pay attention to the book now, baby, please? Now just lay here and listen to the book, sweetheart. The next morning, Stuart started early. To avoid traffic, he thought it would be a good idea to get out on the road before there were too many cars. Okay, now the next morning, he started early to avoid the traffic. He thought it would be a good idea to get out on the road before there were too many cars and trucks, and so he drove through Central Park to 110th Street, and then over to the West Side Highway. Excuse me. Daddy's got a cold. He's having a hard time. And then north to the Sawmill River Parkway. Look at this. Look at the little car driving by the man there, huh? The car ran beautifully. And although people were inclined to stare at him, Stuart didn't mind because he was very careful not to press the button which had caused so much trouble the day before. He made up his mind that he would never use that button again. What button?
The invisible button.
The invisible button. The button that would make the car disappear, Shy. Then nobody could see it.
Not disappear.
Well, you can't see it. It makes it invisible. Now, just as the sun was coming up, Stuart saw a man seated in thought by the side of the road. Now, Stuart steered his car alongside, stopped, and put his head out. He said, "You're worried about something, aren't you?" asked Stuart. "Yes, I am," said the man, who was tall and mild. "Can I help you in any way?" asked Stuart in a friendly voice. The man shook his head. "It's an impossible situation, I guess," he replied. "You see, I'm the superintendent of schools in this town." "Well, that's not an impossible situation," said Stuart. "It's bad, but it's not impossible." "Well," continued the man, "I've always got problems that I can't solve. Today, for instance, one of my teachers is sick. Miss Gunderson, her name is. She teaches number 7 school, and I've got to find a substitute for her, a teacher who will take her place." "What's the matter with her?" asked Stuart. "I don't know exactly. The doctor says she may have rhinestones," replied the superintendent. "Can't you find another teacher?" asked Stuart. "No, that's the trouble. There's nobody in this town who knows anything. No spare teachers, no anything. School is supposed to begin in an hour." He's got to get a substitute teacher like you have sometimes, huh? You have substitutes, don't you, when your teacher can't be there? Another teacher comes in?
Yeah.
Right. "Well, I'll be glad to take Miss Gunderson's place for a day, if you would like," suggested Stuart agreeably. The superintendent of schools looked up. "Really?" "Certainly," said Stuart. "Glad to." And so he opened the door of his little car and he stepped out. And walking around to the rear, he opened the baggage compartment and took out his suitcase. "If I'm to conduct a class in the schoolroom, I'd better take off these motoring cogs and get into something more suitable," he said. And Stuart climbed into the back and he went into the bushes. And then he was back in a few minutes wearing a pepper and salt jacket and old striped trousers and a Windsor tie and spectacles. And he folded his other clothes and packed them away in his suitcase. "Do you think you can maintain discipline?" asked the superintendent. "Of course I can," replied Stuart. I'll make the work interesting, and the discipline will take care of itself. Don't worry about me." Well, how can a little mouse teach these kids? Huh?
It'd be
What do you
hard.
think, Cheyenne?
I didn't know. I think it would be hard.
I think it would be very hard for a little mouse. What if you went in there tomorrow into Mrs. Asher's class and there was a little mouse there wanting to teach school instead of Mrs. Asher? And he was only this big.
I go and pet him.
Well, that'd be nice, but he might not want you to pet him. He might want to teach you things.
Like, what do we do?
Well, anyway,
Sit down!
the superintendent of schools shook his hand. He was very happy. And at 9:15, the scholars had gathered in school number 7. And when they missed Miss Gunderson and word got out that there would be a substitute, they were delighted. A substitute, somebody whispered to somebody. A substitute, a substitute. And the news travels fast, and soon everyone in the schoolroom knew that they were all to have the rest of Miss Gunderson, a rest from Miss Gunderson for at least a day. They were going to have a wonderful experience of being taught by a strange teacher whom nobody had ever seen before. Well, now Stuart arrived at 9. He parked his car briskly at the door of the school, and he stalked boldly into the room, and he found a yardstick leaning against Miss Gunderson's desk. And he climbed hand over hand to the top, and there he found an inkwell, a pointer, some pens and pencils, a bottle of ink, some chalk, a bell, and 2 hairpins, and 3 or 4 books in a pile. And so Stuart scrambled nimbly up the stack of books and jumped the bottom of the well, the button on the bell. His weight was enough to make it ring, and Stuart promptly slid down, walked to the front of the desk, and said, "Let me have your attention, please." Well, now the boys and the girls crowded around the desk to look at the substitute. Everyone talked at once, and they seemed to be very pleased. The girls giggled, and the boys laughed, and everyone's eyes lit up at the excitement to see such a small and good-looking teacher so appropriately dressed. "Let me have your attention, please," repeated Stuart. "As you know, Miss Gunderson is sick, and I'm going to take her place." "What's the matter with her?" said Roy Hart. "Vitamin trouble," replied Stuart. "She took vitamin D when she needed A, and she took B when she was short of C, and her system became overloaded with riboflavin, thymine, hypochlorine, and even the pyridoxine, and the need for which human nutrition has never been established. Now he glared fiercely at the children, and they made no more inquiries about Mrs. Gunderson. "Everybody will now take his or her seat," commanded Stuart, and the pupils filed obediently down the aisles and dropped into their seats. And in a moment there was silence in the classroom. Stuart cleared his throat, seizing a coat lapel in either hand to make himself look like a professor. Stuart began. "Anybody absent?" All the kids shook their heads. "No." "Anybody late?" And they looked at each other. The kids looked at each other and said, "No." "Very well," said Stuart. "That's the first subject you usually take up in the morning. Arithmetic," shouted the children. "Bother arithmetic," shouted Stuart. "Let's skip it." And there were some wild shouts of enthusiasm at this suggestion. Everybody in the class seemed perfectly willing to skip arithmetic for one morning. "What next do you study?" asked Stuart. "Spelling," cried the children. "Well," said Stuart, "a misspelled word is an abomination in the sight of everyone. I consider it a very fine thing to spell words correctly, and I strongly urge every one of you to buy a Webster's Collegiate Dictionary and to consult it whenever you are in the slightest doubt. So much for spelling. What's next? Kids, what do you learn next?" He's not teaching them anything, is he? He's just asking them what's next. Now the kids were just as pleased to be let out of spelling as they were about arithmetic, and they shouted for joy, and everybody looked at everybody else, and they laughed and waved handkerchiefs and rulers, and some of the boys threw spitballs at some of the girls, and Stuart had to climb over the pile of books again and dive for the bell to restore order. "What's next?" he repeated. "Writing," said the kids. "Goodness," said Stuart in disgust. "Don't you children know how to write yet?" "Well, sure we do," they all yelled at once. "Well, so much for that then," said Stuart. "Social studies come next," cried Elizabeth. "Social studies? Never heard of them," said Stuart. "Instead of taking up any subject, special subject this morning. Why wouldn't it be a good idea if we just talked about something? And so the kids glanced at each other in expectation. Could we talk about the way it feels to hold a snake in your hand and then it winds itself around your wrist? Asked Arthur. We could, but I'd rather not, replied Stuart. I don't like snakes. Well, could we talk about sin and vice? Pleaded Lydia. Nope. Try again. Well, could we talk about the fat woman at the circus and she had her hair all over her chin? Begged Isidore. No, said Stuart. I don't want to talk about a fat lady at the circus. No, she said, I'll tell you, let's talk about the king of the world. The king of the world? I've never heard of the king of the world. Have you?
I never heard of that word.
The king of the world? He looked all around the room, hopefully, to see how the children liked the idea. There isn't any king of the world, said Harry. Well, what's the diff, said Stuart. There ought to be one. Kings are old-fashioned, said Harry. Well, all right then, let's talk about the chairman of the world. The world gets into a lot of trouble because it has no chairman. I would like to be chairman of the world myself. You're too small, said Mary. Oh, fish feathers, said Stuart. Size has nothing to do with it. It's temperament and ability that count. The chairman has to have ability, and he must know what's important. How many of you know what's important? Well, up went the hands. Very good, said Stuart, cocking one leg across the other and shoving his hands into the pockets of his jacket. Harry, you tell us what is important. What do you think's important?
I don't know.
Well, a shaft of sunlight at the end of a dark afternoon, or a note of music on the way back, and the way the back of a baby's neck smells when its mother keeps it tidily, said Harry. Correct, said Stuart. Those are important things. You forgot one thing, though. Mary Bendix. What did Harry forget? He forgot ice cream with chocolate sauce on it. She said quickly. Exactly, said Stuart. Ice cream is important. Well, now, if I'm going to be chairman of the world this morning, then we'll have to have some rules. Otherwise, it will be too confusing. With everyone running every which way and helping himself to things that nobody's behaving, we'll have to have some laws if we're going to play this game. Can anybody suggest any good laws? Well, Albert raised his hand, and then he said, don't eat mushrooms. They might be toadstools. That's not a law, said Stuart. That's merely a bit of friendly advice. Very good advice, Albert, but advice and laws are not the same. Law is much more solemn than advice. Law is extremely solemn. Anybody else think of a law for the world? Nix on swiping anything. Don't take other people's stuff, said John. Very good, said Stuart. That's a good law. Never poison anything but rats, said Anthony. Oh, that's no good, said Stuart. It's unfair to rats. A law has to be fair to everybody. Well, Anthony looked sulky. But rats are unfair to us, he said. Rats are objectionable. Well, I know they are, said Stuart, but from a rat's point of view, poison is objectionable. A chairman has to see all sides of a problem. Have you got a rat's point of view? Asked Anthony. You look a little like a rat. No, replied Stuart. I have more the point of view of a mouse, which is very different. I see things whole. It's obvious to me that rats are underprivileged. They'll never be able to get out in the open. Rats don't like the open, said Agnes. Well, that's because whenever they come out, somebody socks them. Rats might like the open if they were allowed to use it. Any other ideas for laws? Well, now, Agnes raised her hands. There ought to be a law against fighting. Kids shouldn't fight. Well, that's impractical, said Stuart. Men like to fight. But you're getting warm, Agnes. Well, no wrestling or scrapping, said Agnes timidly. Stuart shook his head. Absolutely no being mean, suggested Milford. Very fine law, said Stuart. When I am chairman, anybody who is mean to anybody else is going to catch it. Well, that won't work, remarked Herbert. Some people are just naturally mean. Albert is always being mean to me. I'm not saying it'll work, said Stuart. It's just a good law, and we'll try. We'll give it a try. Well, we'll give it a try right now, right here and now. Somebody do something mean to somebody. And so, Harry, you be mean to Catherine. Wait a minute. What's that you got in your hand, Catherine? It's a little pillow stuffed with sweet balsam. Does it say, "For you I pine, for you I balsam" on it? Yes, said Catherine. Do you love it very much? Asked Stuart. Yes, I do, said Catherine. Okay, Harry, take it away from her. Oh, no. Oh, no. Well, Harry ran over to where Catherine sat. He grabbed the little pillow from her hand and ran back to his seat, where Catherine screamed. Now then, said Stuart in a fierce voice, hold on. My good people, while your chairman consults the book of rules, and he pretended to thumb through a book. Now here we are on page 492, absolutely no being mean. Page 560, we don't want to swipe anything. Harry Jameson has broken two laws, the law against being mean and the law against swiping. Let's get Harry and set him back before he becomes so mean people will hardly recognize him anymore. Come on. And so Stuart ran for the yardstick and slid down like a fireman, coming down the pole in the firehouse. Look, there he goes down the yardstick, and he's going to go get Harry, and he ran toward Harry. The other children jumped up from their seats and raced up and down the aisles and crowded around Harry, while Stuart demanded that he give up the little pillow he took from Catherine. Well, Harry looked frightened, and although he knew it was just a test, he gave Catherine the pillow. There, it worked pretty well, said Stuart. No being mean is a perfectly good law. And so he wiped his face with his handkerchief, for he was quite warm from all the exertion. Look at this. He's telling him, you give it back. Okay, it had taken more running and leaping and sliding than he had imagined. Catherine was very much pleased to have her little pillow back. Let's see that little pillow a minute, said Stuart, whose curiosity was beginning to get the better of him. Now Catherine showed it to him. It was about as long as Stuart was high, and Stuart suddenly thought it was a fine, sweet-smelling bed that would make it right for him, so he began to want the pillow himself. That's a pretty thing, said Stuart, trying to hide his eagerness. You don't want to sell it, do you? No, said Catherine. It's my pillow. It was a present to me. Well, I suppose it was given to you by a boy that you met at Lake Hopatchong last summer, and it reminds you of him, murmured Stuart dreamily. Yes, it was, said Catherine, and she blushing. Ah, said Stuart, summers are wonderful, aren't they, Catherine? Yes, and last summer was the most wonderful summer I have ever had in all my life. Oh, I can imagine, replied Stuart. You're sure you wouldn't want to sell that little pillow? And Catherine shook her head. No, don't blame you. Can't say as I blame you, replied Stuart. Summertime is important. It's like a shaft of sunlight. Or a note of music, said Elizabeth. Or the way the back of a baby's neck smells when her mother keeps her tidy, said Marilyn. And Stuart sighed. Never forget your summer times, my dears, he said. Well, I've got to be getting along. It's been a pleasure to know you all. Class is dismissed. And so Stuart strode rapidly to the door, climbed into the car, and with a final wave of his hand drove off in a northerly direction, while the children raced alongside screaming, Goodbye, 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 Stuart! And they all wished that they could get a substitute every day instead of Miss Gunderson. And look, there's the kids coming out of their little school, and here's Stuart driving his little car off. Is that funny?
Yeah.
Okay, now tomorrow night we're going to read about Ames Crossing, because he's driving away across the world, it looks like, in his little car. We're getting towards the end of the book.
To do what?
I don't know what he's going to do. Huh? What do you think he's going to do?
Fight the bird? Next time could we do all of it?
Well, maybe we can. There's not that much left, is there? Let's see. We're on page 100. And we have to go to page...
100?
Yeah, we've read 100 pages already. And we have to go to page 131. I'll bet we might be able to make that next year. Yeah, 131. 131 pages in this book. Okay, here we go. Okay, here we go again, huh? We're going to read some more Stuart Little. See, what's today? Today is January the 10th. We've been reading other things. We read Aladdin the other night. We've been reading other books, so we got to get back to Stuart Little, haven't we?
Yeah.
Don't we, huh?
Because we haven't read like some of my books.
I know. We've still got more books of yours to read, and that wonderful new book of fairy tales that we got for Christmas time.
Yeah.
Daddy got you. Daddy loved that book. Well, this is called Ames Crossing. Look at this. Look at this store. Look at the town. There's a picture. Look at, here's a picture. Yeah, I love the things that you gave me, honey. Look at the pictures of the town. Yeah, black and white. But here comes Stuart. Look at this. He's driving his little, looks like a little toy, doesn't it?
It looks like a rock.
Yeah, driving up.
Right here it looks like a rock.
Yeah, it does. It does look like a rock. And here he is, so he's driving up to the store. So, in the loveliest town of all, where the houses were white and high and the elm trees were green and higher than the houses, where the front yards were wide and pleasant and the backyards were bushy and worth finding out about, where the streets sloped down to the stream and the stream flowed quietly and under the bridge, where the lawns ended in orchards and the orchards ended in fields and the fields ended in pastures and the pastures climbed the hill and disappeared over the top toward the wonderful wide sky. In this loveliest of all towns, Stuart stopped to get a drink of sarsaparilla. You know what sarsaparilla is?
No.
It's kind of like root beer. Kind of like root beer. It's kind of a caramely taste. It's very good. I haven't had sarsaparilla since I was probably a little kid, but it's good. Well, it says, parking his car in front of the general store, he stepped out and the sun felt so good and he sat down on the porch for a few moments to enjoy the feeling of being in a new place on a fine day. And this was the most peaceful and beautiful spot he'd found in all of his travels, and it seemed to him a place he would gladly spend the rest of his life in, if it weren't that he might get homesick for the sights of New York. And for his family, Mr. and Mrs. Frederick C. Little and George, and if it weren't for the fact that something deep inside him made him want to find Margalo. Hi, Travis. We're reading Stuart Little. Did you read it? Okay, now. Anyway, he said that he was going to miss his mom and his dad, and but he wants to find Margalo, isn't he? Who's Margalo?
The bird.
The bird. Now, after a while, the storekeeper came out to smoke a cigarette, and he joined Stuart on the front steps. And he started to offer Stuart a cigarette when he noticed how small he was, and he changed his mind. He says, "Have you any sarsaparilla in your store?" asked Stuart. "I have a ruinous thirst." "Well, certainly," said the storekeeper. "Gallons of it. Sarsaparilla, root beer, birch beer, ginger ale, moxie lemon soda, Coca-Cola, Pepsi-Cola, Dipsy-Cola, Pipsy-Cola, Popsy-Cola, and raspberry cream tonic. Anything you want." Boy, those are kind of funny. The only ones we know are Pepsi-Cola and Coca-Cola, huh?
Yeah, root beer.
That's right, and root beer. He says, well, Stuart said...
Coca-Cola.
Yeah, you know Coca-Cola, don't you, sweetheart?
Coca-Cola.
He says, "Let me have a bottle of sarsaparilla, please," said Stuart, "in a paper cup." And the storekeeper went back into the store and returned with a drink. And he opened the bottle and poured some into the cup and set the cup down on the step below Stuart. Oh, look at how big. The cup is bigger than Stuart. Okay, well, he opened the bottle, poured it into the cup, and sat it down below Stuart, who whipped off his cap, lay down on his stomach, and dipped up some of the fresh cooling drink, using his cap as a dipper. Oh, no, he put his hat in it. He drank it out of his hat. Oh. "Well, now that's very refreshing," remarked Stuart. That's nothing like a long, cool drink. There's nothing like a long, cool drink in the heat of the day when you're traveling. "Are you traveling far?" asked the storekeeper. "Well, perhaps very far," replied Stuart. "I'm looking for a bird named Margalo. You haven't sighted her, have you?" "Well, can't say that I have," said the storekeeper. "What does she look like?" "Oh, she's perfectly beautiful," replied Stuart, wiping the sarsaparilla off his lips with the corner of his sleeve. "She's a remarkable bird. Anybody would notice her. She comes from a place where there are thistles." Well, the storekeeper looked at Stuart closely and said, "How tall are you?" he asked. "You mean in my stocking feet?" Stuart said. "Yes, 2 inches. That's only that big. 2 inches, that's right. That's
I
two.
thought he was 3 inches.
Well, he says 2 inches. 2 inches and 1/4 of an inch, answered Stuart. "I haven't been measured recently, however. I may have shot up a bit. You know, said the storekeeper thoughtfully, there's somebody in this town you really ought to meet.
Yes.
Well, who's that? Asked Stuart, yawning. Harriet Ames, said the storekeeper. She's just your size, maybe a trifle shorter, if anything. Well, what's she like? Asked Stuart. Oh, fair, fat, and about 40. No, Harriet is young, and she's quite pretty, and she's considered to be one of the best-dressed girls in this town, too, and all her clothes are tailored especially for her. That's so, replied Stuart. Yes, Harriet's quite a girl. Her people, the Ameses, are rather prominent in this town, and one of her ancestors used to be the ferryman here in Revolutionary days, and he would carry anybody across the stream. He didn't care whether they were British soldiers or American soldiers as long as they paid their fare, and I guess he did pretty well. Anyway, the Ameses have always had plenty of money, and they live in a big house with a lot of servants, and I know Harriet would be very much interested to meet you. Well, that's very kind of you, replied Stuart, but I'm not much of a society man these days. Too much on the move. I never stay long anywhere, and I blow into town and blow out again, here today, gone tomorrow, or will-o'-the-wisp. The highways and byways are where you'll find me, always looking for Margalo. Well, sometimes I feel I'm not quite near to her, and that she'll just turn the road, and, sometimes she said I feel that I'm quite near to her, and that she'll just be around the turn of the road, and then other times I feel like I'll never find her, and I'll never hear her voice again. Which reminds me, it's time I be on my way. Well, Stuart paid for his drink and said goodbye to the storekeeper, and he drove off. But the Ames Crossing seemed like the finest town he'd ever known, and before he reached the end of the main street, he swerved sharp left, turned into a dirt road, and drove down to a quiet spot by the bank of the river. Well, that afternoon, he swam, and he lay on his back on the mossy bank, and his hands covered his head, and he thought, crossed under his head, and he thought, returning to the conversation he'd had with the storekeeper. Harriet Ames, he murmured. And evening came, and Stuart still lingered by the stream, and he ate a light supper of cheese sandwiches and had a drink of water, and he slept that night in the warm grass with the sound of the stream in his ears. And in the morning the sun rose warm and bright, and Stuart slipped into the river again for an early dip. He's going swimming in the river, isn't he? Know that, Shai? Yeah. After breakfast, he left his car hidden under a skunk cabbage leaf, and he walked up to the post office. And while he was filling his fountain pen from the public inkwell, he happened to glance towards the door, and what he saw startled him so that he almost lost his balance and fell into the ink. A little girl about 2 inches high had entered and was crossing the floor toward the boxes. And she wore sports clothes and walked with her head high, and her hair was a stamen with a flower, and Stuart began to tremble from excitement. It must be the Ames girl, he said to himself, and he kept out of sight behind the inkwell as he watched her open her mailbox, which was about 1/4 of an inch wide, and she pulled out her letters, and the storekeeper had told the truth. Harriet was pretty, and of course she was the only girl Stuart had ever encountered who wasn't miles and miles taller than he was. And so Stuart figured that if 2 of them were to walk together, his head would be a little higher than her shoulder. And the idea filled him with interest. He wanted to slide down to the floor and speak to her, but he didn't dare. All of the boldness had left him, and he stayed hidden behind the inkwell until Harriet was gone. And when he was sure that she was out of sight, he stole out of the post office and slunk down the street to the store, half hoping that he would meet the beautiful little girl, half fearing that he would. Have you any engraved stationery?" he asked the storekeeper. "I'm behind in my correspondence." Well, the storekeeper helped Stuart up onto the counter and found some letter paper for him, small paper, marked with the initial L. And Stuart whipped out his fountain pen and sat down against a 5-cent candy bar, and he began to write a letter to Harriet. "Dear Miss Ames," he wrote, "I am a young person of modest proportions. By birth I am a New Yorker. At this moment I am traveling on business of a confidential nature. My travels have brought me to your village, and yesterday the keeper of your local store, who has an honest face and an open manner, gave me a most favorable report on your character and appearance." Now, at this point in the letter, Stuart's pen ran dry from the long words, and Stuart had to have the storekeeper to lower him head first into the bottle of ink so that he could refill the pen. And then he went back to writing. Look at, he holds him by his tail and dips him into the inkwell. "Pray forgive me, Miss Ames," continued Stuart, "for presuming to strike up an acquaintance on so slender an excuse as our physical similarity. But of course the fact is, as you yourself must know, there are very few people who are only 2 inches in height. And I say 2 inches, actually, I am somewhat taller than that. My only drawback is that I look something like a mouse. I am nicely proportioned, however, and I am also muscular beyond my years. And let me be perfectly blunt. My purpose in writing this brief note is to suggest that we meet. I realize that your parents may object to the suddenness and directness of my proposal, as well as to my somewhat mouse-like appearance. So I think probably it might be a good idea if you just didn't mention the matter to them." He doesn't want her to tell his mom and dad, because they may not want him to meet her, you know. "Being an outdoor person, I am camped by the river in an attractive spot at the foot of Tracy's Lane. Would you care to go for a paddle with me in my canoe? How about tomorrow afternoon towards sundown, when the petty annoyances of the day are behind us, and the river seems to flow more quietly in the long shadows and the willows?" He wants her to go and take a ride with him in his canoe that he's going to make.
Canoe?
Yeah. That's pretty neat, huh?
Make it.
Well, Stuart forgot in the excitement of writing Harriet that he did not own a canoe. "If you wish to accept my invitation, be at the river tomorrow about 5 o'clock, and I will await you."